We're talking about Saturday Night Live and specifically the Weekend Update part of the show, which is Weekend Update is a news segment that, to my understanding, has been in every single episode of the program. When did you first start watching SNL as soon as it debuted, or?
I actually started watching SNL when it first debuted in 1975, and I went to see the show in person. I actually went to a rehearsal before the show because they actually do the show twice, and the first time is a rehearsal and then they do it live. And actually during the first 5 seasons I went twice to see the show, to the rehearsal of the show. So I was aware of the show when it first went on the air because there was nothing really like it on television before, and and it sort of became a hit. It sort of became, I would say, a hit probably like about a few months into when it first went on the air, that people were talking about it. And I guess I've sort of been watching it ever since.
And, okay, so the first episode, George Carlin and Genesee and Billy.
James Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, is that what you're saying?
Right, I'm trying to remember the musical guests.
The music of Billy Preston.
Right, Billy Preston. I remember the song and the fro and all that.
Fro, yes.
Chevy Chase obviously was the first anchor. What were your first impressions of him doing that Weekend Update segment?
First I thought it was very funny idea to actually, because you have to remember you're watching a television show at midnight on Saturday night, and the idea of them doing like a news broadcast. And, there had been parody news broadcasts on other shows, like variety shows have done it, on television. And I could talk a little bit more about that. But, so that wasn't new, but it was just very unusual. I think because Chevy Chase looked like a news anchor, because he sort of had the kind of like handsome, preppy looks, that you would expect like a young newscaster to have. And it was funny because it was sort of the way that he delivered the news, where it was they were doing it as if it was an actual news broadcast, but every story was actually ended up being a joke. The other thing is the stories they were doing were current stories, because this is on the weekend. I mean, that's one thing that Weekend Update is able to do, is keep it relevant, because they're not, they can insert a joke at the last minute if they really wanted to, because it's not until, because it's live on a Saturday night. So if something happens on a Friday, they can still include it. So a lot of the humor was topical, though most of the jokes weren't necessarily about things that just happened. A lot of them, particularly in the beginning, were either political stories that had to do with Gerald Ford, really, because Nixon was already out, but Gerald Ford, but they did make Richard Nixon jokes. And then eventually it would go from Ford to President Carter. So it started in 1975, which was sort of the end of the Ford, sort of at the end of the, sort of towards the end of the Ford administration. So most of the jokes were political jokes, making fun of President Ford, which eventually then Chevy Chase started to do. But the stories were like a combination of political stories and like just sort of human interest stories. Some of them were just jokes. It was almost like, I'm going to tell you a joke, and then you turn it into a news story. And some of them actually were loosely based on things that actually had happened. But some of them were fictional. I mean, some of like I said, they were jokes that were like kind of fictional jokes, about talking about like an animal at the Washington Zoo, for example, which is not, it would be something they would just sort of pull out of the thin air and write a joke about. But then they would do things like, if some dignitary visited, that actually is something that really happened, and then they could actually turn that into a joke. So I guess my point is that the humor was topical. And the idea is that they did this every week. And then eventually they started adding other elements to it, like people giving editorials in the very beginning. People like Emily Lotella and Rosanna Dana. in the very beginning, it really was just Chevy Chase doing this sort of. I think originally, actually, it was supposed to be Lorne Michaels who was going to do the news, because he had his own show in Canada, and I think that they did a news telecast. It's sort of in the book, but I think they did a news telecast as part of their show. Was
that the?
It was like the
Laughing with Lily Tomlin.
No, he wrote for that. He wrote for that show. And they also did. They kind of did a news. Sometimes did a news parody, not every week. No, it was when Lorne Michaels was in Canada. He had a show that was called like the Lorne. I'm so embarrassed I can't even think of names of things. But where he sort of started was, he worked in radio and then he worked in television, and it was a bit of a performer in the very, very beginning. There was a newscast, and so he on the show, and he was going to be the newscaster for Saturday Night Live. But I think what he decided was he was going to have to be the one making creative decisions about whether or not a sketch was going to be on the air, and he sort of felt like it wasn't good politics for the executive producer to say, you're not going to be on the air, but I'm going to go do this news thing, So he kind of just had somebody else do it. And Chevy Chase was, I would say, probably one of the main creative forces in the very beginning of the show.
So you were going to go into the predecessors, if you will, the influences of Weekend Update, and then just in general, this idea of not necessarily sketch comedy, but just parody and satire as far as news is concerned. You want to talk about that?
Probably the most important influence was a British show, and the name of the show was That Was the Week That Was. and That Was the Week That Was, also known as TW3. And this was a show that was on in England, and it was a news parody show that had been done. And they actually presented stories that were about what was going on in Britain that week. It was sort of like a week in review, but it was a comedy show. They actually brought that show to America very briefly. It was not as popular here. They actually shot it in the same studio as Saturday Night Live. And Lorne Michaels often says that show, which was really a satirical show, because what it often did was, it was very, very political, and often would call politicians out who aren't doing their job, in England. And so when they were having elections, they even kind of took it off the air. It was sort of that mentality of how much influence it had. It was very popular, and they did it in the United States for a little while. It just sort of it was one of those shows. I think it went on like mid-season, and then was popular. And then when it came back, it wasn't as popular as it had been before. And it was hosted by a man named David Frost, who is a very well-known.
And he just passed away this past year.
Yeah, he's the one who interviewed Nixon, right. The famous Frost-Nixon interviews. So I think that was one of the shows that he often cites as being one of the influences. There's also a show that was on HBO, but I think that started later, called Not Necessarily the News.
Was that Rich Hall's show? Or he was on that show?
Who is that?
Rich Hall?
Yes. But that was based on a show in England, too. Mm-hmm. I believe. It was the American version of a British show. That was on HBO. I think that started after Saturday Night Live for some reason. Because then Rich Hall was on it, and then Rich Hall went to... And I think Jan Hooks was on it, too. Yeah. But there also were other variety shows, like Laugh-In, for example, which is also another show that influenced Saturday Night Live. Laugh-In was a very odd show. It was a sketch comedy show. Television, it took a long time for television to sort of catch up with the 1960s. Most television was in 68, and when the world was changing in 67 and 68, still looked like television from 65 and 64. But there were a few exceptions. I mean, some of the networks tried to cash in on kind of the counterculture. So there were shows like Mod Squad, for example. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It was made into a movie, but Mod Squad were about three former juvenile delinquents who were like undercover cops, kind of like 21 Jump Street was, but it was more about like they looked like hippies kind of, and they could like, and there were a lot of shows that often had the word young in the title, like young doctors, young lawyers, because they were trying to get the younger audience. The show that was probably the most political and controversial was the Smothers Brothers, which is another show that I mentioned in there, because they often dealt with political issues as well, often got them in trouble, and eventually got them off the air because they were very outspoken, particularly about Vietnam, when nobody else was doing that, and eventually CBS just pulled the plug on them. So that was definitely, that's usually cited as one of the influences of Saturday Night Live. Steve Martin was a writer on the show before he kind of was sort of known as a performer. So there are other shows, I guess my point is, that, sort of did this. It just didn't do it in the way that you described, kind of the idea that, every week at midnight you have, Weekend Update. Shows usually did it more in terms of segments, and sometimes, except for that was the week that was the entire show, really. It was like, it also used music and other things. It's also very well known for, they did a tribute to John F. Kennedy when he died. That was done in England, and then it was shown here, and it was a huge success to like commemorate his assassination. But the thing you always have to remember about television is, particularly American television, is that it's ratings based, it's advertising based. So there's always going to be kind of a limit of how much you can actually do, in terms of subject matter. That's sort of what happened, and that's what kind of got Smothers Brothers off the air. Was that whole idea where it became too political.
Right. So almost going off of that, rating, when we're talking about, ratings-based, subject-based, NBC, I remember reading in the 70s, was very sensitive about, the folks that they had in charge and stuff like that, like specifically like Al Frank and Fred Silverman related things. Yeah. My original question for this was going to be, did NBC have any of these networks that you were mentioning, like the American version of The Week That Was, for example?
I think that was on NBC.
That was NBC?
I think that was an NBC show. Smothers Brothers was definitely CBS, and Laugh-In was NBC. So they were trying to go for the younger audience as well. As I said, Laugh-In was this unusual show. It was not done in front of an audience, though it seems like it is in front of an audience. And it was just a series of jokes. There was often a lot of sexual innuendo. And sometimes they actually did say things that were quite political, against the tobacco companies, like smoking, against Vietnam. But you could only do it so much. And you have to remember, this is in prime time. And the other, big thing that was different about Saturday Night Live is it's on late at night. And that does give you a little bit more room. Not that there's at the time there was nobody who was, looking at things and saying you can do this or you can't do that. But they're given a little bit more, because it's 11:30 at night. Usually the censors or broadcast standards are trying to protect young kids from watching things, but you can sort of assume 11:30 at night that they're not watching it. So, it was a good mixture of having a time slot like that, and then at the same time being able to deal with things that were considered more provocative. I mean, the show is really designed for baby boomers. I mean, it really was designed to be a TV show, and Lorne Michaels talks about this. It's a TV show that was really designed for his generation. Baby boomers at the time. People who were in like their 25 to their early 30s. There was nothing really on television for them. Most TV was for older people or really, really young people. But there was nothing like, if you were in your 20s and 30s, there really wasn't anything that kind of spoke to your generation. And here was a show that was actually being done by people who were of that generation, as well. I mean, all the performers were, mostly in their 20s or early 30s, and the same with Lorne Michaels. So it was, and most of the writers were too, except for a few, but most of them were from, so it was a show it was the kind of show that I think Lorne Michaels is like paraphrasing, but basically Lorne Michaels said, I wanted to create the kind of show I would want to watch, and that's sort of what the show was.
Tying that back into Weekend Update now, how much news would you say you were kind of paying attention to in around 1975, and what do you think was we'll get to the image later, but what do you think was the effectiveness of Chevy Chase's like journalism image? I guess
well, I mean, personally, I was like 13, so I was sort of had some awareness of what was sort of going, some awareness was going on. I was not reading the newspaper, sort of every day. We got it at home. I sort of would look at it. I mean, back then, the primary news source for people was the evening news. Was Walter Cronkite, was, either you watched NBC, CBS, and ABC. And we were like an NBC family. My parents watched, I don't know why, but usually, and if you ask people my age, you ask them that question, you'll find that everyone says, oh, we watched CBS or we watched AB, you watched one of those three, and that became sort of your primary sort of news source. So the stories that he was telling usually the stuff that he was telling jokes about that were actually based on what was actually going on in the world were things actually I was sort of familiar with. They were mostly things, like I said, that were current events, many things that had to do with the president. I think probably at my age, though, I probably couldn't always discern what was real as in being based on something, and what was made up. I probably didn't always know. I think probably someone who was older did know. Mm-hmm. In terms of the image, that he had. I mean, the thing is, he the way that they kind of set the news up, it kind of mirrored like a newscast, but Chevy Chase was a lot younger, and he kind of had longer hair at the time, so he did not necessarily look like, a typical newscaster, because the typical newscasters are much more conservative. The people that were doing the news at the time, like David Brinkley and Walter Cronkite.
Like he looked 30 when those guys looked 60.
Yeah. He really did look like someone who was too young to be doing the news. And I think that was sort of part of his image. I mean, I always thought of him as sort of like an older frat boy. I don't mean that anything negative about frat boys. I just mean that he sort of had like kind of those looks. He just reminded me of a guy who would be in a fraternity or would have gone to a prep school. He was from somewhat of an affluent family, I guess. But he just sort of seemed like that kind of guy. But he was really, like I said, he was sort of handsome, but he wasn't completely kempt. He wasn't like button-down suit kind of thing. So he looked a little disheveled sometimes, which was sort of part of his image, I think.
And you know what? Let's actually stick with those themes, because since I'm primarily covering the first 5 years, this would be an awesome conversation for all these anchors, because I really do feel like all of them, like, there's just no similarities between the, I guess now 24 anchors that there have been. Not counting the weird mid 80s segment where there wasn't a cast member.
There was. It was very strange.
But let's go into Jane Curtin, because I feel like that was the sharpest change,
Yeah.
especially when Curtin was doing it by herself,
Yeah.
like before season 3. Can you talk about her image and her effectiveness as a newscaster?
Well, the transition between, Chevy Chase was kind of the breakout star of the show. He was also the person who got to say his name every week, so people knew who he was. So I think the idea was when they brought Jane Curtin on. Jane Curtin is a very, very smart person. And she was sort of a bit of the odd cast member. She was sort of a little more reserved. But like I said, she was very smart. And I think that the idea that she was smart kind of would give her some credibility as being a newscaster. And she kind of played it as if she was a serious newscaster. It means that she was like Jane Curtin, who did Weekend Update. Because what was always happening is she was being undermined by Emily Latella and Rosanna Dan, all these people. So she always came across as a little bit of, what's her name? Emily Latella used to call her a bitch. I mean, she came off as being somewhat sort of cold. I mean, what was interesting is there were no female newscasters then. The Barbara Walters was a journalist who did reports, but you have to look up and see when she actually anchored the news, because I don't know. It was different in that regard. I can understand why they chose her. If they wanted to choose one of the women to do it, of the 3, Lorraine Newman and Gilda Radner's personas were much more kind of like young and a little bit more like, they played young girls a lot. They were more, Gilda was sort of very out there. And Lorraine Newman was young. She was like 23 when she started. But Jane Curtin was a little bit older, and I think she was a little bit more experienced. And she also had the right kind of delivery, because you needed somebody who could deliver. And, she was a little bit, she had she has a very sharp wit, which is sort of the direction that they went into with the way she would deliver it. The difference between Chevy Chase is Chevy Chase would sort of say a joke. Sometimes he would make a face, and it's sort of like you're aware that he's making a joke. There's sort of a self-consciousness about what he's doing from the very beginning. But with Jane Curtin, it was almost as if she was someone who was reading the news. And sometimes she would just say things and say a joke, but do it straight-faced, without any reaction at all.
Now, why do you think they paired Curtin up with Dan Aykroyd for season 3?
Yeah, I'm sure there were some internal reasons why they did it. Apparently, Dan Aykroyd didn't really like doing it.
Yeah, he only did it for a year.
Yeah, he didn't really like doing it so much because it's not really like his thing. I don't know what the actual. I honestly don't know what the actual reason is why they did it. It could be for a variety of things. I don't know if it freed up Jane Curtin a little bit more, because there were only 3 women on the show, and they were playing like all these parts, and very often, if you think about now, well, Cecily Strong, who does it now, is in sketches, but they had Seth Meyers. Seth Meyers never really did anything else. He just did the news. Really, he would appear once in a while, in the background, but he was also the head writer of the show. So it is you're right. It is a completely different thing. But in terms of I think that they probably chose Dan Aykroyd because he was someone who did characters. I mean, he was like one of those people who you never really knew who Dan Aykroyd was, and so he was sort of on the same page, let's say, as her. It was sort of on the same page as Jane Curtin, where he could present stuff and read stuff as if it actually is real. I mean, he was one of those people that part of his humor is he would play things very seriously, and that's what sort of made it funny. I just think probably he didn't like doing it so much because that's not really he's not really a joke teller. You know what I mean? In that way, and you kind of have to be. Bill Murray is a little bit more of a little bit more of a throwback to Chevy Chase.
As far as the point counterpoint thing that Aykroyd and Curtin used to do, can you speak to the image of the journalist there, because that is, I feel like, one of the most clear examples of something in news media being kind of emulated in sketch comedy.
Yeah, I mean
satire.
that is. I mean, you're right, because that was one of the rare things that they did, which was actually a direct parody of something. The point counterpoint debates that would be on 60 Minutes. So people knew what they were referring, making reference to. There wasn't really much else that they did that was directly, that was directly kind of imitating something that actually existed. And it became a way for them to sort of talk about issues, and usually there were things that were current, that were actually being discussed and being debated. Of course, the irony is it became them, what it became famous for was more about saying Jane, you ignorant slut, of the things that they did not do, obviously, on 60 Minutes.
Right.
If anything, I think it sort of highlighted a bit of the absurdity of the 60-minute things, because it was a debate that basically, and I think you can go online and watch an example if you've never seen it of the 60 Minutes debates. There were these debates that lasted like a minute or 2 minutes. That's not really much of a debate, but in some ways it was the predecessor to shows like what's it called, like the ones that are on CNN,
like Hardball,
or more the one that Jon Stewart would always make fun of, where you have a liberal and a conservative, Crossfire, yes. I mean, it sort of was, that really was kind of the in some ways kind of the predecessor to something like Crossfire, because one person gave one opinion, another person gave another, and one was a liberal, a well-known liberal, and one was a well-known conservative.
Mm-hmm. So going into Bill Murray, because I feel like he is different than Chase in that I felt like Chase really owned his presence as far as this. I'm clearly telling a joke. I'm clearly just doing this because I'm for the hell of it. And I think Murray was a little bit more conservative than that as far as like his image and pairing up with Jordan. But it's also clear that Bill Murray had a lot more fun with it than
I think
Aykroyd.
that I think what you're saying is accurate. I think that Chevy Chase was sort of being himself in some ways. I don't know if that's really the way he was in 1975, but I think the idea was what you were seeing behind the thing was sort of like that was Chevy Chase. Bill Murray sort of came on, and I don't know if when he started doing the news he was really being Bill Murray. I think he kind of morphed into the real Bill Murray when he started doing like Stargazer segments and started doing the Oscar predictions, when he started acting more like a jokester.
When he was doing his like editorial part of the segment.
It was usually much more with that. I think that he became a little bit more like like Bill Murray. I mean, he had like an improv background, as did all these people really, to some degree. But Jane Curtin did, and Chevy Chase did, Bill Murray was part of Dan Aykroyd was part of Second City. So even though there was not really any improvising going on the show, which is, I think, always an important point to make, that improvising was something that was very much frowned upon and really kind of prohibited in some ways. They did not like doing it because it threw the director off. But what they kind of do is kind of give the feeling, or the make it seem like they are improvising. I think the ones who are really good on the show are people who make it look like it's really spontaneous and not rehearsed. You know what I'm saying? Usually the ones who seem like they're having fun.
Like you see the energy, but you know that it's
controlled. And Bill Murray was always like that, I think. Bill Murray was someone you could put him in anything, too. As opposed to like Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi kind of emerged as a persona too, where he would like do the rants and seem angry, you know. Dan Aykroyd was, they always thought of him as more of a chameleon, that he could imitate people. He did most of the impersonations, really, kind of on the show. But Bill Murray was a little more of a jokester. He's like the guy you want to hang out with, And he always had like a kind of a smirk on his face. So I always thought it was funny, the idea of him doing the news. Because when one thinks of the image of a newscaster, one thinks of someone who's very authoritative. And, usually it's, they're put in this position, really, of power, of the one who's sitting behind the desk and is telling you what is going on in the world. And the idea of having someone like him doing it always seems sort of funny, as with Chevy Chase, too, I think also. Because they were kind of clowns, They kind of smirked and they sort of, they did not really kind of exude a lot of authoritativeness,
right,
about things.
You briefly got into the correspondence, especially with, Gilda Radner doing her specific
characters,
that played off of Jane Curtin, and then John Belushi, who apparently only came on Weekend Update to spin out in a rant.
Right. And I have a feeling that the Emily Latella character, for example, was actually introduced in a sketch first,
right,
and then was brought on to like Weekend Update. And I don't think I'm not sure about this, but I don't think the original concept was to piss off Jane Curtin. I don't think that was something that they probably thought of when they conceived the character. I think it turned into that, or that became very, very funny. It also became an easy way to end the sketch, or her piece. I think Roseanna was much more conceived as someone who completely also then pissed off Jane Curtin, and I think Emily Latella really came first, and so on. But you're right; it was someone to sort of play off much more, sort of like Jane Curtin, and it also emphasized Jane Curtin's character as being a very serious. I'm very, very serious about the news. I try to do a serious news show, and you all screw up. You come in here and you're not ready, or Rosanna Dennis talking about something that doesn't make any sense, or John Belushi just like, it seems like he's out of his mind. She probably was. So it all sort of disrupted the sort of thing that she tried to, this image, in some ways the persona that she had created.
And what do you remember about Garrett Morris's role at the end? Sometimes he did the hard...
the hard of hearing thing, I think, was something that Chevy Chase created, for him. I mean, Garrett Morris was always somewhat marginalized on the show. I think partly because he was an African-American performer. I also think because he had a very different background than other people. He was really hired as a writer initially, and then sort of did become part of the cast. And he had much more of a sort of theater background than like an improv background.
And he was so much older than...
And he was older. He was really kind of the... I think he probably was the oldest of all of them. There's a great interview with him. I believe you can access it on the Archive of American Television with Garrett Morris, and he talks about his time on a Weekend Update. There's other people you can look up too that have done. It's like an archive it's called the Archive of American Television. You can access it online, but they put interviews, and they interview not just like stars, but they interview people like below the line people. I read I sort of looked at the interview for Garrett Morris to sort of talk about. I mean, he was sort of very grateful he had the job that he was working, and he was, on this show, which was a huge, sort of a huge hit. So he did that, and he did the guy who used to say baseball is very, very good to me.
Chico Escuela.
Yeah, who also, I think, Chico Escuela was also in a sketch first.
Yeah.
And then became sort of a, running character. So they started using people more and more on the news. Well, initially, you don't really see that so much with Chevy Chase. I think Emily Latella was on probably first with Chevy Chase.
And then you had Lorraine Newman. Even though you discussed how she was young and you wouldn't think her as an anchor, but how do you feel about the effectiveness of her role and her image?
Well, she certainly didn't look like any reporter on television, because she looked like a girl you'd hang out with in a rock concert. But she sort of, she was 23, I think, at the time, 22, 23. I definitely think she had, her appeal was the fact that she was young. And with her, it wasn't so much like the character she played, it was more that she would be at places and she'd actually be there too early or too late, or she was always at the Blaine Hotel, which is where there was a running joke on the show, where there was always a murder being happening. So she did it very straight when she did sort of her her bit with having a reporter on the scene. So I think they were trying to utilize pretty much everybody on some level.
Right.
In fact, I think Lorraine Newman was probably the first, because she did these sort of remotes. Was probably the first to actually, with Chevy Chase, to appear, and then probably Emily Latella. I'm not exactly positive about that, but you probably look that up easily.
Now, over the course of 5 years, I mean, writing is this weird thing where when you see it at its best, it's like that's what you remember.
Right.
But for the most part, it's driven by inconsistency, blocks, and almost as rarely as the very best, you have the very worst, where it's like, well, that was bad. Were there any moments where you noticed that, especially in season 5, where it just seems like things just burned out? Yeah. I'm not sure. No one really talks about Weekend Update specifically.
Yeah.
Did you notice any of the quality of Weekend Update wavering, or any of the dead spots?
Well, I think generally, I mean, I do think it does sort of start to get old. It's like you're using the same format every week, and it's only going to be as funny as the jokes. Because once we've, by season 5, we've seen all the characters that they've done. And, if anything, one of the faults of the show is it depends so much on repetition. And, if a character is a bit of a one-joke character, as most of them are, Rosanna Dana is going to go off tangent. I mean, it might be funny what she's saying. That's what you sort of have to hope for. But Chico Escuela would have like a catchphrase. Baseball being very, so it kind of, I think in some ways the format of it kind of got somewhat tired. I think the jokes were always a mixture of hit and miss. I think that's one of the reasons they do a rehearsal, because they want to see what jokes work and what jokes don't work. I think that it was, you have to think of it this way. It's part of a much larger kind of machine, and sketches are going to be hit and miss too. And, Weekend Update is like the old reliable thing that you can always go back to. And it's the thing you can go back to and things that worked. I mean, they did that with sketches, where they would do the Coneheads. They would do like these recurring, sketches. And in some ways, the news was like that too. I mean, the news is sort of a recurring sketch, and they, the reason why they did recurring sketches is simply because if people found them funny, it's like, how many times can we sort of do this? It's sort of a bit of an insurance policy. I think it's probably very hard to put together a show that's going to be all original material. Also, you have to think about audience expectations, about what audiences are going to expect to see and want to see. And you want to give them you have to give the audience somewhat what they want. And the news became a way for them, I think, to actually, do that.
And I guess the last set question I knew that I had was, obviously those 5 years, a lot of people are always going to remember the 70s part of the show. The show has found a way to sustain for another into 2014 and 2015.
Yeah.
What sets those first 5 years apart, as far as Weekend Update is concerned, compared to how the show is taking the segment going forward?
Well, first of all, I think you always have to be careful, because I think the people involved in the show would even admit to this. You have to be careful not to romanticize, the first 5 seasons. I think what they were doing at the time was really original, and I think a lot of the humor was cutting edge. But there were some bad shows that they did, and there were jokes that weren't funny on Weekend Update that flopped. It wasn't all terrific and wonderful, and so on. But I do think that it was what made it so special was the fact that it was in fact the sort of mixture of the talent and the time period in which it was actually on the air, and how it was doing something that no other show was actually doing. So I think it had all of those things pretty much in common. I think that the challenge became, how do they sustain it as they sort of moved on and put more new talent in. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And you can kind of go point by point and season by season and look and see who the people are who are doing, who are anchoring. And just sometimes it worked, but it wasn't always because of it didn't always not work because of them. Sometimes it was the writing. I mean, I would emphasize, if anything, it all comes down to the writing. I think it's like, personally, I think it's like 60% writing, 40% delivery. I think the writing has a lot to do with it, about who's writing the material. Because I think you can have people that are just not, who are not funny in that sort of way that the original people were. I think of people like Christopher Guest used to do the news. Christopher Guest is not a really funny guy. He's very talented, makes very good, makes comedic movies. But he's not he's not really kind of a sort of comedian. He's sort of reserved in some ways. But he could deliver a joke. And if the jokes are funny, it didn't really matter so much. It would be a different kind of Weekend Update. I guess is what I'm saying. And I think it really, what made it a different kind of Weekend Update is who was sitting behind the desk and how they were delivering. I think what the problems they ran into was trying to emulate and mirror what happened the first 5 years in seasons like 6 to 10, for example, where they were always trying new people. Even Bill Murray's brother became the anchor for a while.
That was a complicated season.
Yeah, it was a very complicated season, and they kept trying and moving all these women as being like the co-anchor, and they tried to make it like there was jokes in between them, like they had an affair or something, and it just wasn't funny. It was very forced, and a lot of it was because these people didn't really have, I just don't think the same sort of chemistry was there. They also didn't have all the same writers. Charles Rocket was sort of interesting because he was the one who took over in season 6, and he actually was a news anchor professionally before he became a comedian. And he really did look like a news anchor, kind of a local news anchor, let's say, not a national. Chevy Chase probably looked more like a local news anchor than I was saying before, than a national. And the writing was just bad. The jokes weren't funny. Yeah. It wasn't so much because of him.
I thought, you said this in your book, and because 8081 is like a dirt mine, it's hard as hell to find stuff, but the few times I saw him, I cringed, not because of any preconceived notion that I was supposed to cringe watching that season, but it's like you're watching it, and it's like, he's really not a good performer.
No, he was the wrong kind of performer, and I don't even know if they knew what kind of performer that he was. I think they thought because he had anchored the news, he would be right for doing it. But he would do this thing where he would read a joke and then sort of like make kind of react almost like if he was the one listening to the joke.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He kind of like had this sort of, he was sort of smarmy and smirky, but not in a fun Bill Murray kind of way.
Or even in a Dennis Miller way, who...
Yeah.
Because Miller was also a journalist.
Right.
And then did the show, and I mean, that would be an interesting thing, too, because I know that he started slow in that 85, 86 season. Maybe.
And then eventually, And I think with him, it's a little bit kind of like about owning the joke. It's like you kind of have to write it for the person who's sitting behind the anchor desk. And I think what they did is they just sort of stuck... because Charles Rocket used to do a Man on the Street report that was actually kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because it was sort of like talking to the people like who weren't really the right people or whatever, and that was sort of part of the joke.
Like you could tell he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and he knew what he was doing, and he was a little bit more in control. He did like the Rocket report. But then when he was behind the desk, it was like telling bad jokes one after the other. And there were just too many. There was just too many bad jokes. And you didn't miss anything. Season 6 was bad. I mean, the best episode of season 6 is when Bill Murray hosted. He was trying to help them, basically.
Yeah.
But the cast, it was just like kind of a lot of the problem was really the person who took over. The woman who became the producer had worked on the show previously, but she was not a creative person. She was not on the creative side. She was the person who booked the guests.
It would be as if Marcy Klein were to take over now.
Well, I don't know. Marcy Klein's been doing it she has been doing it a long time. I don't really have like a sense of like what Marcy Klein's contribution is to the actual show. I would doubt that she would become the producer. I think that would be. She could become maybe the executive producer of the show, but. It will be somebody. I mean, obviously Tina Fey would be the perfect person, but she said she doesn't want to do it, and I wouldn't blame her because it'd be kind of going backwards, I think, for her. And also, it's sort of an exhausting job. But I would be. I think of Marcy Klein as more like kind of a line producer. It's somebody who runs the show, but isn't someone who's like a creative force behind the show.
Right.
I don't know what kind of input she has, if any, about the sort of creative input.
And is there anything else that you'd want to add specifically about the image of the journalist from Weekend Update?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I think in a weird way, it kind of humanized journalists, and I think that's always been an issue about journalists. Also. First, to make the distinction between journalist and anchor, which I'm sure you've kind of discussed. I mean, because they are sort of two different things in terms of who's the actual news source that we're getting it from. Back in the day, they were journalists who were actually anchoring the news. I think you could always tell whether or not the jokes were something they were involved in the writing of. As opposed to they were being given jokes and say, here, deliver them. I mean, I do think there's something about owning a joke, and if you're actually involved in the actual writing of it, and it doesn't even mean that you have to be a writer, but it has to be sort of written for you. And I think the mistake in the bad seasons of Saturday Night Live is people were just writing jokes and then handing them to someone and say, here, deliver these. And I think that what was so different about the first 5 seasons is they were actually writing for the people sitting behind the desk. Much more.